Bonjour à tous et à toutes et bienvenue. Je suis Greg Richards, je suis vice-doyen des programmes professionnels at Telford School of Management, University of Ottawa. A few words about our relationship to the conference first, and then we'll move on to the session. University of Ottawa is very proud to be part of this conference. We have a number of irons in the fire, so to speak, when it comes to this notion of a better Canada. And obviously public policy is a very important element of that. So our Professional Development Institute, School of Management, our co-op office, all of the research centers, we have a lot to do with thinking about this notion of a better Canada. So I'd invite you to drop by the virtual booth later on. When you get a minute, you can get a glimpse at what the university is doing related to improving how we as Canadians go through our lives on a day-to-day basis. What I would like to do is to give you a few housekeeping items to think about. Pour la traduction, on a a live transcript. Vous pouvez le voir just at the bottom of your screen there. So if you turn that on, I see most of the mics are muted. So that's a good practice. We are all used to Zoom things now, or Teams, or Google's, or whatever you're using. We know we need to close the mics. For questions, there are instructions in the chat, and you see the QR code on the screen. We're using Slido, so you can put your questions there, or if you would like, you can also put your questions in the chat in Zoom. But if everyone went to Slido, I think we'd have a good handle on all the questions. So this session is demystifying the budget process. Is it not all about Benjamin Wardens? As some of you know, it's a fairly complex process, budgeting in the public sector context. So we're thrilled to have three panelists with deep experience in different aspects of this budgeting process. We'll go through 2 rounds of discussion. First round, each panelist will take a particular approach and talk about their experience and some of the issues that we want to be aware of. The second round, we'll talk about emerging out of COVID, some of the financial realities. There's some, every country has gone through this process of opening the bank, so to speak, and trying to fund and support the economy as we've gone through this, this pandemic over the past 18 months. So there'll be those 2 rounds. And then we'll be able to get to some of your questions that will be on the screen. So with that, I'll stop and go to our panelists to have them introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to the first session. So first we have Sahir Khan. Sahir, can you provide a short introduction for us?
Hi, I'm with the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. It's set up with, I run this with Kevin Page, Canada's first parliamentary budget officer, where I was assistant PBO and helped to set up the operation. Before that, I spent 3 years at the Privy Council office and helped to steer the first 3 budgets for Prime Minister Harper. And prior to that, I was a Treasury Board Director of Oversight, just prior to, just after Kevin Page had lured me from a very happy career in New York, turning around troubled companies, convincing me that public service mattered and my kids would be getting old before I got to meet them. So I am here now, and I've been working for Kevin, with Kevin now for 15 years, and it's been quite a treat. I think he's been on a prior panel. But yeah, I hope to share my insights inside and outside the government on putting these together, and maybe demystify a little bit of this process.
Great. Thank you very much. Here, Louise, please.
Hi everyone. Alors, je suis très heureuse d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. Je vais faire mes commentaires en anglais, mais s'il y a des questions en français, je vais essayer de les répondre. I've been at the IMF for the last 3 years, and in Washington, we don't speak a lot of French, so I'll do the best I can in that respect. But yeah, so I spent 31 years in the public service. The last 3, I represented Canada at the IMF and the World Bank. It was a fascinating experience being there during the pandemic, and what all we had to do. I can share some insights on that. And then before that, I was the Deputy Minister of Employment and Social Development Canada. And importantly, I spent 19 years at the Department of Finance, the Federal Department of Finance, and where I saw many, many budgets. For 4 of those years, I was the associate at the Department of Finance. So I've seen, like I said, many budget processes. The process has certainly changed over the years. I remember a time when budgets were actually 300 pages or less, and much more focused on fiscal and economic frameworks of the country. I'm happy to share the process that I've seen and the evolution of the budget process, but certainly what I've seen is that there's been a concentration of power, a concentration initially towards the Department of Finance, and then a little bit later, a greater concentration at the Department of Finance and at the Privy Council office. I can talk also a little bit about the cabinet decision-making process, which I think has had its ebbs and flows and how it interacts with all of that. And I'm also happy to talk a little bit about the challenges that the current environment and the evolution of the budget process, how concentration of decision making, what it can result in, how there tends to be decisions made with a little bit less information than there would otherwise be, and what the issues are that result from that. So I'll stop there for now. Thanks, Craig.
Okay. Merci, Louise. Et puis Scott.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Bonjour à tous. I have spent 34 years in the Ontario government, up until a few years back, mostly in line departments. So I can give kind of a balanced perspective of being in a line department versus being in a central agency where I spent the other half of my career. Most of those years, in either one of those places, I was a policy person. Spent many years in cabinet office policy, so the equivalent of the Privy Council office in Ontario, including as Deputy Minister of Policy in the Cabinet Office, and then the last 4 years as the Deputy Minister of Finance. That wasn't necessarily an expected move for me, given that I'm not a finance person by either education or by career experience. I am admittedly, and I think seen by most to be a policy generalist. So I had my own transformation. I'm going to try and give some of my perspective based on that transformation, kind of learning more about the budget process and leading the budget development process as a person who didn't grow up in the finance department. I transformed again by moving from, I guess, the largest provincial or territorial jurisdiction in terms of budget size to the smallest. I'm the Deputy Minister of Finance in Yukon now. And that also gives me a bit of a cross-jurisdictional perspective. I've been there for 2 budgets, 3 if you count the fact that the legislature was recessed and or dismantled and when an election was called, and so the writ was issued and before the budget was passed, and so we had to redo it all again when the government took office again. So I'll use my experience in demystifying the budget for myself. I would like to talk a little bit about how different parts of the public service engage with the budget process and the connections between those different parts of the government ecosystem that create a process and a continuum for a healthy budget development. Not done perfectly anywhere, I dare say, but I think if with some of the right tips and tools, it could be done in a process that would cause us not to have to demystify it again.
Great, thank you very much, Scott. And so just a little bit about my connection to this. I worked in the federal public service for a number of years. I was in the FI category, so I watched a lot of numbers go back and forth. Now in my role at the university as Vice Dean of Graduate Programs, that means I have the MBA, the EMBAs, and so on. We spend a lot of time talking about budgets and money as a lifeblood of any particular organization and how to use it wisely. So this is an important area for me. And I do research on the public sector right now, how to use data and analytics to improve public sector performance. So this is a very important area for me, both from a research and a teaching point of view. So welcome again, and we have a great panel here. We'll have a super interesting discussion, and then again, we'll monitor your questions. No need to wait until the end of the session if you want to put questions in Slido. We'll monitor them as we go through, and make sure we get to as many as we can once the presenters are finished. So we'll start with Scott, who is going to chat a little bit about the budget process and some of the politics involved. We'll move to Sahir, who will talk a bit about the broader ecosystem, and then to Louise, who will address it from kind of the line department aspect and some of the pitfalls and challenges that we're facing. So Scott, I'll turn it over to you.
Merci. I'll try and keep this as short as possible to allow enough time for discussions and Q's and A's. I think, and certainly I'll say a few things I'm open to be corrected on them. It may have been, well, it definitely will have been done differently in different places. So I'm only speaking about my 4 Ontario budgets and my 2 or 3 Yukon budgets. And what I've observed in working with some colleagues from across the country. But I think part of what has led to the mystique or the mystery is the notion that finance did the whole process in a black box in fortress finance, shrouded from the rest of government. And while that may have been the case in prior years, I don't think it's that way, or not that way as much anymore. Of course, there is the need for confidentiality and sensitivity, especially for things like tax measures or for other things that could move the markets. But other than that, I would suggest the budget development processes are, in my experience anyway, more collaborative and open than they were in the past, up to a point. And at some point, and when the document gets closer to being published, it does become, primarily a finance function. The other half of the title that I wanted to unpack a little bit was, is it all about the Benjamins or the Bordens? And I'd say, of course, it is. It needs to be. It must be. If you strip everything else away from a budget, some of the nice to haves, you're left with the absolute necessity of assigning spending powers and limits to departments or ministries or appropriations, as we call them, based on estimated needs, hence the term estimates. It's an underpinning of our democratic system that in the Westminster model of Parliament that the legislature have the opportunity to authorize that spending. And so I think that needs to remain as the core and crux of what a budget is intended to do. And that is involving assigning spending. What has evolved over time, and I think is indisputable, and may have led to some cynicism about a budget, is the use of the budget as more of a communications tool that explains the goals and aspirations and priorities of the government of the day, and a sense among some parts of finance that the words have become much more important than the numbers. You can't really deny the point that communications and the size of the document, as Louise has referenced earlier, has led to more wordy and kind of more aspirational language than you would have seen in the past. I invite you to do something I did often when I was the deputy in Ontario, is go back and look at the digitized versions of budgets. They have put all of the budgets back to, I think, 1898 online. And it's pretty fascinating to see the evolution of budgets from a very, I would say, very numbers heavy. Even the words were much more accounting centric than they are now. It is an interesting little bit of research. So yeah, less numbers heavy, more word heavy. That's not a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. This has become, maybe it wasn't always, but this has become for the elected officials, for public servants, for media stakeholders, for external financial and economic bodies, one of the few marquee documents in a life cycle of a government, and perhaps the only one that is forward-looking, comprehensive in terms of an all-of-government view. It's done annually, and it's done with fairly predictable timing, whereas some of the other documents that are aspirational, like speeches from the throne or platforms or mandate letters, are a little bit more difficult to predict the timing of. So of course, given all that, it's going to be a communications heavy document. I think there's also a bit of a false dichotomy, sorry, a bit of a false dichotomy, though, that the budget is portrayed as a tug of war between the communications elements as one extreme and the accounting interests and the numbers at the other extreme, and perhaps with some resentment in both directions. It's false because, of course, it needs to be both of those things in today's realities, not one or the other. And I would suggest that now, if it is done properly and with the right timing, advanced timing and input, it has the potential to be both of those things, plus an informed priority setting exercise and conversation between all of the key players in that ecosystem I referenced earlier, which is Finance Treasury Board, elected officials and their staff, line departments, policy and finance experts, stakeholders, and other third-party representatives. The annual dance amongst these parties sometimes feels like a negotiation, often feels like a negotiation, and that's because you always have competing interests or goals in play. You have the fiscal benchmarks like the surplus or deficit, or the net debt to GDP, year-over-year growth figures that can't be too high or can't be too low. You have the size of your capital program, all of that versus the policy program and communications goals that the government has established for you. And sometimes those things will threaten and push some of the fiscal goals offside. That's why it becomes a bit of a trade-off discussion rather than a negotiation, in the sense that it needs to be one that needs to be well prepared and responsive. You need responsive line department experts to help determine an array of options for policy objectives and reasonable and defensible price points for what those options are for new projects and policies. The pressure sometimes comes down to how to get an announceable about a new program or policy without throwing the fiscal framework out of whack and having too much impact on surplus deficit or net debt. And in that regard, Finance and Treasury Board does become, I think, the honest broker in trying to determine whether what the department is saying needs to happen in the budget actually needs to happen, and describing the implications of doing that. And of course, places like the PBO and the FAO and ISFD are helpful as an extension to I guess keep government honest in those regards. Remember, there are 1,000 moving parts in any budget. They're all interconnected, and when you adjust something or add something like spending or a revenue measure or a capital project, then there's some whack-a-mole that has to happen. Something is going to change in another part of the fiscal framework, and you need to either explain that or go and correct it. This is made a lot easier if expectations are established well in advance and ministries have a chance to work up options for new budget initiatives so they can respond to changes quickly. They're not asked out of the blue about what would it cost to have a new dental program or a new pharmacare program. They've had a chance to be involved in some of that workup. They don't necessarily know the outcome, but they know kind of the advice that they gave and the information that they passed along. This is the work that I argue fills in the continuum between the strict counting and the numbers and the communications. The heavy lifting of the policy and program development that can be fed into the decision-making process, priority setting discussions, cost-cutting options, revenue-generating options, alternative methods of achieving the same goals in a different way is exactly the kind of behind the scenes work that leads to, I think, healthier budget development process with healthier input from all parts of the senior management team across government and all departments. So it's that informed collaboration that maybe the way I'm describing it may be a little Pollyannish, but I think I've seen more of that behind the scenes collaboration happening than I did when I was in a line department, I'd say. And it necessitates constant, healthy two-way communications as well. So those are always healthy conversations to be having amongst senior leadership in departments. And the budget process, I think, should be used as a catalyst to have those priority setting conversations, and don't make the input from the departments just a template filling exercise. I guess what I'm saying is don't waste the opportunity, and maybe it won't need to be demystified as much in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Scott. And we'll move to Sahir. Sahir, please.
Thanks, Gregory. I thought what Scott described could have general applicability from the provincial government to the federal government, and I'll leave the expertise of Louise to tell you, what goes on in the Department of Finance. But as Gregory highlighted, I'll try and talk about a little bit of the broader ecosystem. So at the IAPC, actually, we developed a course with Treasury Board and the Association of Canadian Financial Officers called Unlocking the Black Box of Public Finance. It's basically such a good topic because it is complicated. And when we kind of open it by looking at this broader ecosystem that Scott kind of touched upon. And we're in the middle of an election, and this is actually where the fiscal framework starts in a way. Governments and even opposition parties begin to kind of lock in commitments, cost estimates, surprisingly, right now. So when we are looking at these costed platforms, they start to cast a die really for the way a future government is going to spend. And if it's a minority parliament, then it's just as important what some of the opposition parties have come up with in their platform. So, Scott mentioned this is a very political process. And often among public servants, we use communications as a euphemism for political. Somehow we find it difficult to say it's a political process, but maybe it's okay. I'm out now and I'll say it's a political process, right? The fiscal and economic stuff that used to be kind of the lifeblood of this stuff is in an annex right now. And maybe, talking to the current director of fiscal policy, maybe that's a good thing because at least it's a clean section at the end of the document after we've gone through all the kind of the political narratives and, and a chicken in every pot. But I think one of the things that, a couple of things we're talking about is that these elections do set a process in motion. And then from there, you get from the speech from the throne, you get mandate letters, and you got all the work that's going on within departments. And with some of the reforms we've seen in the federal government, more and more accountability has been devolved to departments, line departments actually cost the proposals, to vet the proposals, because when they're kind of compiled in a central agency, and by central agency, I really mean finance more often than not taking the lead. And as Louise kind of highlighted, sometimes PCO and PMO have an outsized role. And when I was there, I think that was kind of the case where it was very much heavily concentrated. And I'm not saying that as putting a value judgment. I think just the reality at the time. And you've got to have everything from incredibly well-developed MCs that are fully costed, third-party validation, to the proverbial back of a napkin at the former High's restaurant downtown. There are very few of the back of the envelope costing, but sometimes there's a 2-pager and that's it. And sometimes the less evidence there is to support an idea, the stronger the correlation with it being a politically generated one. And you can tell why the system doesn't want to kind of track information particularly well. And that's the beginning of the black box, right? Like there's an old saying, a dog will not fetch a stick with which it'll be beaten, right? So you don't get a lot of this evidence coming out. When we're in the PBO, we'd ask the government for data, and very often the government would say, it's not in your jurisdiction to have this. Privately, our friends in the central agency, we don't have it. It was written on a napkin, or it was political. There's really no evidence. And that's the reality. And we kind of knew that, and they kind of knew that. It's a little public dance. But I think sometimes we think that that's a bad thing. And the reality is public servants, we are not elected officials. So the elected people are the ones that can be held accountable to it. So eventually the stuff does get out. I remember once I was working on the guts of the budget, which was the sources and uses table, which is really just the expected revenue sources. And I remember because Louise was at the other side, she was the head of tax policy. So they'd figure out how much money we're going to get combined with fiscal policy. And then we'd be compiling all the measures, myself as the director of fiscal policy, and we've got a table. So what's going to the prime minister and the finance minister is this table back and forth. And one day, Kevin Page, my boss at the time, the assistant secretary, said, I need you to give this copy to the prime minister. And he packs it in a briefcase. My very first budget, the briefcase is locked. He hands it to me and he says, you're gonna have to take it to center block because the prime minister's not here in lingerie, what was called lingerie at the time. And I said, and jokingly, I said, Kevin, I'm a director general, I'm a director of ops. Do I look like a courier to you? And Kevin looked at me and said, there are 6 people that know what's in that briefcase and you're one of them. You can only hand it to him or his chief of staff, Mr. Brody. That's it. And that was my first kind of introduction to just how close that world could be. And a lot of it because it was it had become over the years such a political document, and with all the opportunities and risks of it being a political document. So that little table that started to kind of gel all the ideas and all the influences, when things started to come together and the triaging of ideas started to happen, that started to become incredibly secret. Just to illustrate, our performance management agreement for Kevin and I said budget leak, yes, no. Like it was just that simple. It either leaked or didn't. And the clerk was going to hold us accountable for that. So I got scared really early about that kind of secrecy, and it took me a long time to understand kind of what was beyond it. Scott's, I think, talked about the different influences that come in, and they're all true in that they all come to bear. At some point, the process starts to close. And as that list starts to get whittled down between the finance minister and the prime minister, that's after everybody's had their input. Then the process starts to get tighter and tighter. And just to illustrate how close it could be, I remember at one time, the finance minister, I won't say which one, was doing pre-budget consultation on the Hill in front of one of the committees. And I was kind of scratching my head why this was going on, because we knew the document had already been gone to printing. So there's a theater that's going on in terms of different process. And that's not the rule. That was probably an exception. But it just tells you at some point the process comes to a halt. And that process becomes incredibly secretive in terms of how all those pieces come together in that final document. And I'm not involved in the printing process. Maybe Louise could tell you even how secretive that is. But that is kind of the closed black box nature of this. And of course, everything changes. This election is worth following because you've got costed platforms. You get the potential of another minority parliament, which means whatever a governing party comes up with isn't the last word on this anymore. Everybody here there's a value to read, not just the platforms, but when they hit the costing and the PBO costing and the IPAC, we do with the Toronto Star, we do an assessment of fiscal credibility and overall kind of test of reasonableness on the whole thing. And it's a bit of fun. But I think part of it is we know how important these things are to kind of setting that fiscal framework in motion. And we have to do it for all the parties, and we're being very careful, and we're hosting all the parties here in the office. They get free advice. I know they don't take much of it, but they ask for advice, but they also know that we're going to assess them later. And I think they want to understand how we're going to do this. But that is why all bets are off if there's a minority parliament. And what the governing party comes up with will only be a piece of it. And you'll have a benefit of it being a far more open process, because under minority parliaments, governments can be held to account in committee. I can tell you, being at the PBO under minority and majority situations, under minority, the chairs of committees could compel information out of the government. When it was a majority, things just stopped. And that's kind of why we care about how this election kind of plays out. And the reality is you get much better transparency in a minority context. I'm not saying you get better outcomes or better fiscal management. I'm just saying from a transparency point of view, you're going to get more of it. So I think this is I wanted to kick this off in terms of this ecosystem, right? Like it is a political process. It starts with this election. And we teach this in the course. We have platform writers from each of the parties that come and talk about this, just how much you start to hard code from these platforms. And I'll use one example. I'll close on this. When I was in the Privy Council office, the Harper government was often accused of having a hidden agenda. And I would kind of marvel at the critique of this hidden agenda, because we were literally taking Stand Up for Canada, their platform, and Louise actually was the boss at PNP and helping develop the speech from the throne. And there were chapter headings that you would take from the platform to the SFT. And then when we were crafting the budget, those same chapter headings would migrate to the budget document. There wasn't much of a hidden agenda. People just read the documents. We were just going from one process to the other. And not every government has that discipline. But, think about the mandate letters that your minister and deputy ministers, and I'll leave it to Louise to describe, the rigor with which those are kind of looked at. Because, our sense is they had started to have teeth. And we would start to become gatekeepers at cabinet at PCO when things weren't in the mandate letter. Like, why are you bringing this MC? Why would we schedule it? What's the point? There is a focusing. So while there's a lot of stuff that's kind of a black box, and the forecasting stuff's a black box, and maybe the product as it's getting closer to the end of the process can be a black box. But there's an awful lot that you can see if you kind of read the tea leaves, you look at the full spectrum of what's available in terms of the influences on that process, and keeping in mind at all times, it's a political process. It's increasingly so. So follow the political documents, follow that narrative that they're putting out, and then watch as money gets applied to that narrative with a certain discipline. And then you start to know whether a government means it. They can say an awful lot of things, but when they put money against an idea, it means that they want an outcome. They want to send a message. And all of a sudden, the black box starts to open, and now you've got accountability for results, and the public and parliament can start to hold a government to account. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Sahir. Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Greg. Boy, there's been a lot of very interesting things said by Scott and Sahir, and I think my comments are gonna marry nicely with some of the things that have been said. I just wanted to pick up one from something Sahir said about different governments have had different approaches. I think that's actually a very fascinating comment, because I was at the Privy Council office during the Conservatives tenure, and it was really, from their platform, cut and paste to what their agenda was. I found it very interesting being at the center where we would set agendas, being in an environment where the Conservative government had already set the agenda. So I thought that was a very interesting approach. And then also the current government was very, very keen on mandate letters. And those mandate letters really were the very clear direction of what departments could and couldn't do, and what they could and couldn't bring forward. And PCO got very strict about, is it in your mandate letter? And if not, then don't bring it forward. And there were always exceptions to that, but it was very clear. And so again, I think getting a hold of, and especially that the mandate letters were then made public. In the past, they were never made public. And so that was a very, black box-ish kind of environment. But when you make mandate letters public, then that really does demystify quite a bit. I just wanted to also pick up on the comment Scott made about, and I mentioned at the beginning, about the concentration of decision making and what that means. I think this is a really important point. When the concentration of decision making does take effect, I think there are some consequences. First of all, those that are left out obviously get frustrated. And that's a political and a non-political statement. If you're not part of the decision-making process within a party, that can cause its own dissent from that perspective. Also, I think another really important issue there is that if you do have concentrated decision-making, you're actually reducing the diversity in the decision-making process. And there are studies that have been done, including at the IMF, that show that greater diversity results in better decision-making. And this can also result in decision-making happening with less information. I remember briefing the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister on upwards of 30 measures in one sitting, where decisions are made really quickly and not necessarily given how quickly everything's moving, with full consideration of the facts. And this is not in any way a partisan comment. I've seen it happen under different governments. And then, you know, if you don't have access to those making decisions, that also can cause issues. And because the budget timeframe is so constrained, that can also result in frustration. But let me talk a little bit about the line department aspect, because having had all this experience at the Department of Finance, when I became the Deputy Minister of Employment and Social Development, I really wanted to make sure that we could work in the priorities of employment and social development into the budget making process. So, I mean, so what are some of the best practices or the lessons I learned in trying to do that? First off, I mean, obviously, line departments need to know what their priorities are. And of course, we had to know what direction we were going in as a department so that we could then contribute to the budget making process. We would develop our medium-term thinking through kind of medium-term exercises or through transition planning. As Sahir said, the transition planning is a big time when you really kind of come up with the direction of where you know, what the priorities are of the government or the line department itself. We do this, of course, in concert with discussions with stakeholders, and be that internal or external. But once you know where you want to go, you really have to look for policy windows. Where are the policy windows opening? You can have the best analysis, the best policy thinking, ideas, but if you don't know the context or the political environment that you're functioning in, you will have little success. What we would do is we would start the budget process actually in June. We'd gather up all of the ideas and priorities of the department. I would put out a call as the deputy to the whole department saying, okay, what are the ideas, what are the measures that we want to put forward in the budget? I mean, we came up with an upwards of 150 ideas. Of course, these ideas had been worked on for months or sometimes years ahead of time, which ones were ready at the time. We'd then have senior management would then meet collectively and discuss all of the ideas, determine which ones were the most urgent and of the highest priority. We would determine which then fit best with the government's overall priorities and the themes of the budget. And of course, we would do this in conversation with many colleagues, including the PCO and the Department of Finance. And once we vetted our list down, we would then kind of write, so here mentioned these one-pagers, we would write one-pagers. But they call them one pagers, but they can be as long as 20 pages, depending on what the topic is and what all has to be analyzed. These one pagers kind of included all the analysis we had, including what stakeholders' perspectives were, what the costing was. It would include all of the evidence that was available to make the case, gender-based analysis, environmental impacts, implementation considerations, all of that. We would then discuss all of this with our minister. They would then decide which items they wanted to put forward for the budget process. And at this point, we would be very close to September when the call letter from the Minister of Finance would come. As my experience, not at the beginning of my tenure at the Department of Finance, but towards the middle and the end, the Minister of Finance would send a...
Fuck.
Oops.
Okay, I got her muted. Is that better?
Hello? Hello?
Sounds like you're okay to continue, Louise. Yeah. Not sure what happened there.
No, that was funny. Okay, so we'd be close to September. The call letter from the Minister of Finance would come. This letter would articulate priorities and how the focus of the proposals needed to be coming into the Department of Finance, what the current fiscal environment was, et cetera. And so then, you know, what the minister would want to put forward to the Department of Finance would then be finalized in a letter that the line department minister would send to the Minister of Finance. And then we would then send all of the one-pagers associated with all those ideas over to the Department of Finance so that they would have the information and the analysis that had been done in the line department. One thing that I didn't really talk too much about was the cabinet process. So, and that comes again to the concentration of decision-making, et cetera. Some of the ideas that we would put forward would have gone through the cabinet decision-making process, but others may not have had the time. I'm kind of happy to explain why some of these would and wouldn't have had gone through the cabinet decision-making process. Maybe if there's a question on that, I'm happy to answer it. But suffice it to say that where it had gone through the cabinet decision-making process, there would have been more discussion, right? It would have gone to, there's always a process when you're doing cabinet documents. It goes to departments, everybody comments on it. It goes to central agencies. Central agencies then have the ability to comment on it. It goes to cabinet, it goes to other ministers. There's a discussion, a vetting, a back and forth. But that doesn't always happen. That sometimes happens after the budget decision's been made and the budget announcement's been made. So having said now, let's say our measures are with the Ministry of Finance, and the Department of Finance then kind of vets these ideas. They could reduce the proposals, they could increase them, they could of course just drop them entirely, which happened a lot. But sometimes they would add new ones. And sometimes doing this would not affect the proposal, like it would be fine to go forward with it. The substance of the proposal would be fine, but other times there could be significant impact on the proposals. And you can imagine this is all done under extreme time pressures, as the budget, has a timeline and it has to eventually come out. So you can see kind of pitfalls that might come out of that. Changes in time crunches can lead to unintended consequences, an inability to think through all of the implications of a change to a particular measure. There's little time for costing analysis and discussions that would normally take place with the Treasury Board, who can be instrumental in helping to kind of finalize those cost estimates, or discussions with key stakeholders. If you don't have discussions, if you'd worked on a proposal and had discussions with key stakeholders, and then the measures kind of change at the last minute, that can impact how stakeholders would react to the proposals. There are of course mitigations that are undertaken, and I can get into those as well later. But suffice it to say that it's that moment in time when you're talking to the Department of Finance and these ideas are being finalized, that's when fearless advice and truth to power come in, and the strength to say where things can and can't be done. I've been in situations where I've had to say, I just don't think we can implement what you're proposing, or it's going to take 6 months longer to implement what it is that needs to be put forward. So all of that comes into play when finalizing the budget, and what comes out at the end of the day is what obviously cabinet approves, because the budget at a very high level goes to cabinet at the end of the day. I hope that kind of enlightens a little bit on the budget process from a line department perspective, and a little insight into the Department of Finance as well. I think I'll stop there. Greg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Louise. So one of the fun games I like to play is see if I can connect your comments directly. So Scott's soundbite was, words are more important than numbers, which I thought was a really good way of summarizing what the heck do we use budgets for anyway? It's to get stuff done for Canadians, right? Sahir mentioned it's a political process, and it's interesting that depending on the government that we have, majority versus minority, the black box might open a little bit more in a minority context. And then, Louise, I think one of the points you made is from a line department's perspective, if you want to get your priorities across the goal, so to speak, you need to look for some policy windows. In other words, it links to what Sahir was talking about. It is a political process, and you need to be aware of that. So what I'll do is there are a couple of questions here that I think bear on that kind of theme. One is, to what extent does program evaluation play a role? And maybe, Louise, from a line department perspective, you can reflect on that, and Scott as well, potentially, yeah?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Did you want me to do that now?
Yeah, I'll do it now, and then if we have some time, we'll get to the last question, which I'm going to change a little bit for you just because we're bumping up against time, but I did want to get some of these questions in, yeah.
Sure. So I'm really glad somebody asked that question, program evaluation. And I have a very strong opinion about that, especially working at Employment and Social Development Canada. We had a very, very strong evaluation group, and I'd have to say I've seen different evaluations group, and the way that evaluations can contribute to policymaking, I think, varies depending on the strength and the analysis that's done. So my experience has been one where we had a very strong evaluation group. The evaluations that were done were done kind of at every stage. There was a touch point with the deputy and senior management. We would talk about what the study would cover, what aspects, what the scope would be. And then, midway through, we'd kind of have a discussion around where were we going with the results. And then the final product would come out. And those final products, they entirely went into the analysis of what the next measures should be going forward. And we used them as evidence. Those evaluations were used then and summarized in the one-pagers that I talked about that could be as long as 20 pages. And so, again, I'm not saying that that's the case in every department, but it certainly was the case for the evaluation group at ESDC. Their input was incredibly valuable in the process for determining what we would do as measures going forward. Because if we had a proposal for skills training, and if the evaluation said that it really wasn't very effective, then why propose further enhancements to that? And as opposed to what, if that came out of the evaluation, we'd say, well, I think we should wind it down, see what the lessons learned were from it, and morph and change the program so that it would actually have more impact. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's interesting. We're not good at sunsetting things. We're always good at launching things. I've got a question here for Sahir and then one for Scott. Sahir, do you see any risks of budget documents becoming too political?
I think I mentioned that there needs to be a primacy in the democratic process, so that ultimately the opportunity for elected officials to kind of to outline a vision and then apply resources to execute that remains their prerogative. The difficulty is that if there isn't an internal discipline on how you spend that money, we actually have done a study of this in the PBO that at the IFSD. There are actually political implications. So this is actually where, and I know my colleague Kevin Page was in the previous panel on the public service politician interface, but this actually really matters. If you have processes that are purely political, without the evidence, the accountability, Louise talked about, evaluations and the need for feedback loops, ultimately those same politicians wear it. So if we don't have a certain discipline in the system and control gates throughout, and I would say policy, program, and financial control gates, then ultimately these things get out of control very quickly. We looked at elections since 1867 and tried to understand whether incumbent governments, whether there was a correlation between the electoral results for incumbent governments and whether they carried a deficit or a surplus heading into an election. There was no correlation, none at all. And it disappointed us, of course, as fiscal people. We wished it meant everything. But then we also spent a bit of time trying to understand the last few elections and what we call operating efficiency, kind of the execution side of public finance. And the reality is, by looking at articles published, the failure in execution and that discipline, where the public service plays such a key role, actually has brought down governments. So think about, the Chrétien Martin government. Think about sponsorship and gun registry. They were running surplus budgets, right? Think about the end of the Harper government. They were having trouble buying fighter jets. They had $18 orange juice. And I'm not arguing whether these things matter on the same level, but I'm just arguing that the execution starts to matter. And again, that's where having these exercises that are purely political actually is a mistake as well. And I think we have to find a way to have a balance between the opportunity for politicians to tell Canadians what they want to do, what problems they want to solve, but to have as much effort, and a lot of this falls on the shoulders of public service, particularly its leadership, is to make sure that government and the government of the day is protected, so that those non-political elements of evidence, of results, of financial discipline are applied to those ideas. At the IVC on our Twitter account, we have a pinned tweet, and I pulled it up. It's from Thomas Edison. It says, "Vision without execution is hallucination." And that's our pin tweak. That, as an organization, actually, that's what we believe in. We spend a lot of time working with departments now on the execution side and trying to convince politicians that it matters. And, they only sort of figure this out after they've lost an election, that, wow, that stuff that the public servants were telling us, turned out it really mattered. And our theory has been that the longer a government is in power, the more that there's an interdependence with the public service, and they start to own the things that they launch, the narratives that they put out when they first got in power. Those chickens come home to roost. So that execution part of a budget and all, and the appropriations and the programs and planning and evaluation, all that stuff really starts to matter. And we're trying to convince politicians they've got to pay equal attention to that other part, or it will knock them out of office.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Scott, interesting question here. Why does the money disappear on March 31st? The rest of it says we could never survive if we did that personally. Can you imagine March 31st, all the money in your bank disappears? So Scott, you want to talk about that a bit?
Well, you probably, I don't know, we probably have more fiscally experienced people to ask on this, but I guess it may help for a layman to explain how he makes sense of it, which is the fact that, in fact, the money doesn't disappear, the authority to spend the money disappears. So you don't have authority on April 1st to spend the dollar that you had yesterday. You need to get more authority. And that is the same, that's the authority of the appropriated amounts that have to go through Parliament or the legislature. There are exceptions to this, of course. We have targeted accounts, things that carry over and be able to spend from it again and grow over time. I think some of those in respect to our carbon rebate program in Yukon, but yeah, generally speaking, it's a difference between accounting and fiscal planning and authorization for spending to get to those services that Sahir talked about earlier. The money doesn't disappear, but the authority to spend it goes away, and that's why you've got the what we used to call in Ontario March Madness, where departments would find very creative ways of spending money in March because in their eyes they lost it. They had to go and fight for those dollars again, or by the time they get to March, they've already fought for those dollars, and are hoping that they get enough dollars in the upcoming budget that will let them do the things that they want to and need to do.
Great, thanks for that. There are a couple of questions here that deal with things like deficit and budgets under austerity and all that. So I thought I might go back to the panel for a bit, and then we'll come back if we have time to get to a few of the other questions. So yeah, so we've got a beautiful deficit and a great debt if you look at it at the federal level. So let me go in reverse order this time. Louise, what are your thoughts on this massive deficit spending that we've gone through, and what does it look like as we come out of COVID?
Thanks, Greg. Just 2 seconds on the previous question. I just want to say that the money doesn't, first of all disappear. There are carryovers, carryovers, I forget what they're called now. They're like 5% or whatever, which I think is a really important thing. It actually has diminished March Madness and whatever happened around there. There also has to be the fiscal discipline. You're allocated a certain amount of money, and that's what you're supposed to spend it in a particular year. And there has to be an ability to budget. So if the most departments wouldn't be in a situation where they would have more more funds left over than the carryover, but when they did, there really has to be an ability for the finance department to be able to budget like annually and figure out what the framework is, et cetera. So just that was just a little aside from the past question, but I think just on the deficit situation, I think, and on COVID and the financial realities that we're facing right now, I think I'm best placed to talk a little bit about this from the international perspective, given I just came from the IMF. So if you'll permit me, I'll do it from that perspective. The IMF's advice here is to first ensure that kind of the national level policies reinforce multilateral efforts to secure the recovery. So, and the key thing that the IMF said over and over again is that no one country can get out of this alone. And I think that's really important. The second point that the IMF would make would be that policy efforts at the national level, so at the level of Canada, and the provinces should continue along, I think, the following lines. First, to prioritize health spending, including for vaccinations and targeted support for affected households and firms. Next, in the medium term, we need to kind of support the reallocation of labor, as we know what's happening with the labor situation, and capital to where it will result in the most effective growth. And then finally, we need to think about the future and investing in the future by advancing kind of the long-term goals of boosting productivity. Canada has always had a productivity issue. Accelerating the transition to lower carbon dependence is another one, and ensuring that the gains are kind of equitably shared. Fiscal actions, of course, should be kind of nested within a credible medium-term fiscal framework to ensure debt sustainability. That's where fiscal anchors and rules are key. The recovery is not, I don't think, assured until the pandemic is beaten back globally. We're seeing, and that really has an impact on you know, the deficit situation for any one country. And we're now seeing, right, how variants can result in resurgence and what an impact that can have. Concerted, well-directed policy actions at the multilateral and national level can, I think, make the difference between a future where all economies experience durable recoveries or one where there's divergence. The poor get poorer, and that social unrest and there are geopolitical tensions that grow as a result of it. I think that Canada has a lot to do in that realm. Canada's a G7 member and has it has always punched above its weight. We say that all the time. Canada is very well respected within the international community, and I think will continue to be so. And so I think that's kind of the circumstances around COVID and the financial realities and the fiscal situation. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. So I've got about 4 minutes left. So here, and then Scott, maybe like your 45-second take on the deficit thing. So here.
You know, I think the IMF advice, IMF and Louis' advice for the world applies to Canada. Our chief economist at the IPAC, Mustafa Scary, put out a paper fairly recently that looked at long-term fiscal sustainability of the federal government. And basically, not only are we sustainable, there are probably some room for some of the measures, absent any big tax increases that parties are thinking about in this election. What our analysis did find is that the federal government probably can't afford to do anything really big, that the pandemic has probably eaten up a few of the signature measures it was thinking about. We estimated on budget day, it probably ate up 2 of them, and I'm told with good authority that it ate up 3 of them. And so the pandemic has been chewing up space. But the thing to keep in mind kind of long-term, as long as economic growth ticks along just a little bit higher than the rate of spending for the federal government, think the debt to GDP ratio will continue to decline and will remain sustainable. What that also means, though, is that for the provinces that have more of the demographically sensitive areas, such as healthcare, they are going to continue to struggle with fiscal sustainability for decades. And so we're going to see this kind of fiscal imbalance. But before the provinces can kind of ask the federal government for more money, wait till this election is over, because I think any remaining space is likely to get used up, along with some potential tax increases. But the short answer is we are sustainable, but stay tuned for this election and see what happens.
Super, thanks for that, Scott. 45 seconds on that issue.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is everybody talks about the new normal, and I think there they mean, you know, what does it mean for health protection, and what does it mean for society and what we do? I'm really intrigued by understanding the new normal for spending levels. What's the equilibrium we get to that says, okay, we don't have to spend as much as we did last year, but we need to spend something in order to stay prepared for that. What is that equilibrium? How does it fit in? What's the new normal for the economy? A place like Yukon depends on tourism. Is tourism coming back in the way it did before? Are people other than me going to start getting haircuts again? Who knows? We've built contingencies into fiscal frameworks to deal with some of this. And that may be the way we have to deal with it, because nobody really knows what the new normal is going to be for waves of COVID. I'll leave on one other point, which is, again, I always try to end on an optimistic point, which is I hope there is room to have the conversation about how government service delivery can also change so that everything that happens doesn't just lead to an incremental cost increase. And if people are behaving differently, if they're getting their services differently, is there an opportunity to change the price curve of some of our services so that we can say, okay, people are more inclined than ever to get their services online. We seem to have managed fine using Zoom and Teams and not having to travel to meetings all across the country.
Right.
There are cost savings components that may help to mitigate some of the cost increases. There's a much different scale issue there in terms of the increases versus the decreases, but I hope there's room for that conversation.
Great. Thank you all very much. That ends this session. Obviously, we could have probably gone on for 3 hours, but we had 60 minutes. So thank you all. And thanks for everyone for showing up. Merci à tous et à Paul and everyone else who worked on this. Thanks very much.